When most people think about the origins of sophisticated finance, about credit instruments, bills of exchange, institutionalized banking, and the legal enforcement of commercial contracts, they think about Renaissance Italy, Florence in the 14th century, the Medici in the 15th, the emergence of double-entry bookkeeping, and the slow, painstaking construction of the financial infrastructure that would eventually underpin European commercial expansion. This timeline is off by approximately 400 years. And the city that makes it wrong is not a city most financial histories spend much time discussing. At its peak in the 9th century, Baghdad was the largest city on earth outside of China, with a population estimated at between 500,000 and 1 million people, at a time when Paris had perhaps 20,000 and London fewer than 10,000. It was processing trade from China, India, East Africa, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean simultaneously, through a financial system that included credit instruments allowing capital to move across thousands of miles without any physical transfer of gold or silver. It had courts specifically designed to enforce commercial contracts between parties who had never met and might never meet. It had a knowledge infrastructure that was treating the translation and systematization of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering not as cultural enrichment, but as a deliberate productivity investment, the medieval equivalent of research and development. Baghdad's Golden Age was not an accident of geography or a gift of conquest. It was the result of a series of deliberate design decisions made by people who understood, with remarkable clarity, that prosperity is engineered, that wealth follows connection, and that connection requires infrastructure, institutional trust, and the continuous reduction of friction in the movement of goods, capital, and knowledge. Understanding how they built it, and understanding why it eventually failed, is one of the most instructive exercises in economic history available to us, because the decisions they made and the mistakes they made are decisions and mistakes that every complex economy repeats. Welcome to Hidden Ledger, where we open the books that were never meant to be public. If you want to understand the real mechanics of how wealth is built and lost, not the version in the standard history, but the version in the systems and the structures, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every video we publish is another page of the ledger, the hidden one. The first and most important thing to understand about Baghdad's rise is that the city did not grow organically. It was designed, constructed deliberately on a blank site, by a ruler who understood that location was not a passive advantage, but an active, strategic decision. In 762 CE, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur selected a site on the western bank of the Tigris River for a new imperial capital. The selection was not arbitrary. The site sat at the confluence of the Tigris with a network of canals connecting it to the Euphrates, giving the city simultaneous access to river trade routes running north into Anatolia and south to the Persian Gulf, and therefore to the Indian Ocean trading networks that connected East Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. The overland Silk Road routes from Central Asia and China converged on the same region. Al-Mansur was not choosing a capital for administrative convenience. He was positioning a city at the center of the most productive intersection of trade routes in the known world. The city he built was circular, a design that was both symbolic and functional, placing the Caliph's palace and the central mosque at the geometric center of a planned urban layout with 4 gates opening toward the cardinal points, each aligned with a major trade route. The circular design minimized the distance from the center to any point on the perimeter, reducing the friction of internal movement in a city that was built to process the continuous flow of merchants, goods, and information. This is not medieval urban planning as decorative exercise. It is logistics architecture applied at city scale. Within a generation of its founding, Baghdad had become the primary node through which Asian trade reached the Mediterranean world. The goods that passed through it, silk, spices, paper, ceramics, precious metals, cotton textiles, generated customs revenues that funded the administrative infrastructure of the Abbasid Caliphate, and, crucially, generated the mercantile wealth that would be reinvested in the financial innovations that made the system self-reinforcing. Geography was the initial advantage. What the Abbasid administrators built on top of it is what made Baghdad's prosperity durable for 3 centuries, rather than collapsing at the first disruption. The central challenge of long-distance trade in any pre-modern economy is the same challenge that confronts any financial system. How do you transfer value across distance when the physical transfer of gold or silver is slow, dangerous, and expensive? The answer that 9th century Baghdad developed, and that would not be independently replicated in Europe for several more centuries, was the institutionalization of paper-based credit instruments backed by enforceable legal contracts. The instrument that made this possible was the sack, a written order instructing a banker in one city to pay a specified sum to the bearer on presentation of the document. This is, structurally, a bill of exchange, precisely the financial instrument that historians of European commerce identify as the foundational innovation of the Italian merchant banking system in the 13th and 14th centuries. Baghdad was using equivalent instruments in the 9th century. A merchant in Samarkand could sell goods, receive a sack drawn on a banking house in Baghdad, travel to Baghdad, and present the document for payment without carrying a single coin across the intervening distance. The financial risk of the journey was transformed from the physical risk of transporting gold to the institutional risk of the banking house's creditworthiness. And that risk, crucially, was managed by a legal system with courts specifically designed to adjudicate commercial disputes and enforce financial contracts. This legal infrastructure is the element that is most consistently underemphasized in accounts of Baghdad's commercial success, and it is the element that matters most from a financial systems perspective. Credit instruments without legal enforcement are worthless. The sack worked not because merchants trusted each other as individuals, many of them had never met and would never meet, but because they trusted the institutional framework within which their contracts were embedded. The Abbasid legal system provided what economists call institutional trust, a credible commitment by a third party, the state, to enforce agreements between private parties who might otherwise have no mechanism for resolving disputes. This is the same function performed by contract law in every modern economy. Baghdad's 9th century merchants were operating within a framework of institutional trust that was, in its essential architecture, recognizably modern. The banking houses that issued sacks were not simple money changers. They were financial intermediaries, channeling capital from savers and surplus holders toward merchants and traders who needed it for commercial operations, earning returns on the spread between deposit rates and lending rates, and building the kind of long-term reputation for reliability that was itself a form of capital. The financial system that Baghdad developed reduced the friction of trade across the entire Silk Road network in a way that made the aggregate volume of that trade substantially larger than it would otherwise have been. This is the compounding logic of financial infrastructure. Better institutions produce more trade produces more surplus funds, better institutions. The House of Wisdom is the aspect of Baghdad's Golden Age that receives the most attention in popular history, usually framed as a story of cultural patronage, enlightened caliphs funding scholars out of a love of learning that transcended the commercial concerns of their era. This framing, while not entirely wrong, misses the economic logic that drove the translation movement and made it one of the most consequential investments in productivity in pre-modern history. Beginning in the late 8th century and accelerating through the 9th, the Abbasid Caliphate funded a systematic program of translation, bringing Greek, Persian, Indian, and Syriac texts into Arabic, covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, agriculture, and philosophy. The scale of the investment was substantial, and the selection of what to translate was not random. The texts prioritized were those with direct applications to the productive challenges of a complex, geographically dispersed commercial empire. Astronomical texts that improved navigation and therefore the reliability of long-distance trade routes, mathematical texts that improved accounting, surveying, and engineering, medical texts that addressed the health challenges of a rapidly urbanizing population, agricultural texts that improved the productivity of the irrigation systems on which the food supply of a city of 1 million people depended. Al-Khwarizmi's development of algebra, the word itself is Arabic, derived from the title of his 9th century treatise, was not a cultural achievement detached from economic application. Algebra provided a systematic framework for solving problems involving unknown quantities, which is precisely the kind of problem that arises in commercial accounting, in the calculation of inheritance shares under Islamic law, and in the engineering of irrigation and construction projects. The mathematical tools developed in Baghdad's intellectual institutions were deployed directly into the productive infrastructure of the city's economy. This is research and development in its most literal sense. Investment in knowledge production with the explicit purpose of improving economic output. The knowledge economy that Baghdad built had a further dimension that is easy to overlook from a distance of 12 centuries. The translation movement created a common intellectual vocabulary across a vast multilingual, multi-ethnic trading network. A merchant from Khorasan, a banker from Cairo, and a navigator from Basra, all operating within the Abbasid commercial sphere, shared access to a common body of mathematical and scientific knowledge encoded in Arabic, the lingua franca of the network. This shared knowledge infrastructure reduced the transaction costs of doing business across the network in the same way that a shared legal framework reduced the transaction costs of enforcing contracts. Connectivity is not just physical, it is cognitive, and Baghdad invested deliberately in both. The Mongol siege of Baghdad in 1258 occupies the role of definitive ending in most accounts of the Golden Age, the moment when Hulagu Khan's forces destroyed the city, killed the last Abbasid Caliph, and reduced what had been the intellectual and commercial capital of the medieval world to rubble. The destruction was real, and the human cost was catastrophic. But the identification of 1258 as the moment of Baghdad's fall is, from an economic systems perspective, a misreading of the evidence. The system had already been failing for more than 2 centuries before the Mongols arrived. The siege was not the cause of the collapse. It was the terminal event of a structural decline that had begun long before. The Abbasid Caliphate's economic system depended on a specific form of political architecture, a single, coherent authority capable of maintaining the legal infrastructure, the security of trade routes, and the administrative coordination that made the system function as an integrated whole. That architecture began to fragment in the second half of the 9th century, as provincial governors accumulated autonomous power, as rival dynasties asserted control over peripheral territories, and as the central caliphate's effective authority contracted toward Baghdad and its immediate surroundings. The fragmentation was gradual and uneven, but its economic consequences were structural and cumulative. When the political authority that guaranteed the enforcement of commercial contracts became unreliable, when a merchant could no longer be confident that a sack drawn in Baghdad would be honored in Basra, or that a dispute with a trading partner in Syria would be adjudicated by a court both parties trusted, the institutional trust that had made the financial system function began to erode. Without institutional trust, the credit instruments that had allowed capital to move without physical transfer of gold reverted to being pieces of paper backed by personal relationships rather than systemic guarantees. The network contracted toward the relationships that individual merchants could personally verify, and the aggregate volume of trade contracted with it. The loss of coordination also affected the infrastructure that required continuous collective investment to maintain. The irrigation systems of the Tigris-Euphrates basin, which had supported agricultural productivity across the region for millennia, required ongoing maintenance that was only possible within a coherent administrative framework, capable of coordinating labor and resources across the relevant watershed. As political authority fragmented, that coordination broke down. Agricultural productivity declined. The food supply for the cities of the region became less reliable. Population fell. The urban density that had made Baghdad's commercial ecosystem viable began to thin. By the time the Mongols arrived in 1258, they were not destroying a functioning economic system. They were destroying the physical remnants of one that had already lost most of its systemic coherence. The libraries burned, the canals were damaged. The population that survived the siege was a fraction of the city's peak. But the institutional trust, the financial infrastructure, and the administrative coordination that had made Baghdad the economic capital of the medieval world had been degrading for generations before the first Mongol soldier crossed the Tigris. The lesson that Baghdad's history delivers is not a romantic one. It is not about the tragedy of a great civilization destroyed by external force. It is about something more structural and more transferable, that prosperity is a system, and systems require maintenance. Al-Mansur did not build Baghdad at a strategic crossroads by accident. He built it there because he understood that wealth follows connection, and that connection requires deliberate infrastructure, physical, institutional, and cognitive. The canals and the trade routes were the physical layer. The legal system and the credit instruments were the institutional layer. The translation movement and the House of Wisdom were the cognitive layer. Each reinforced the others. The system worked as an integrated whole precisely because all 3 layers were being actively maintained and developed simultaneously. When the political framework that coordinated that maintenance began to fragment, the degradation moved through all 3 layers. Routes became less secure, contracts became less reliable, knowledge production slowed, and the compounding logic that had made the system self-reinforcing in its growth phase operated equally powerfully in its decay phase, each layer's deterioration accelerating the deterioration of the others. This pattern of engineered prosperity built on connection and trust, and of structural decay driven by the fragmentation of the coordination mechanisms that maintained it, is not a medieval phenomenon. It is the template for the rise and fall of every complex economic system in history. The cities, the technologies, and the institutional forms change. The underlying logic does not. Wealth follows connection. Connection requires maintenance. And the moment a system stops investing in the infrastructure that makes it function, the physical infrastructure, the institutional trust, the shared knowledge, it has already begun the process that ends at the same place Baghdad ended in 1258. Not with a bang, but with the slow erosion of the things that made the whole greater than the sum of its parts. If this changed the way you think about what prosperity is and what it requires, if you want to understand the systems beneath the history, the machinery behind the empires, the structural logic that keeps repeating whether or not anyone is paying attention, subscribe to Hidden Ledger. Wealth follows connection. The map is in the ledger, and we are reading it one page at a time.